Hi, this video you're about to watch on the long-term causes of the American Revolution is more like an oral essay, and a handout version of this presentation is available on the course page on EDSB if you like. My thesis today, or in this video, is that the American Revolution was caused by three things. It was caused by population growth and movement, economic expansion, and imperial reform. The 13 colonies were a very popular place for people from all over Europe with little to nothing. The colonies attracted individuals as a land of opportunity, a chance to make their lives better. And it was a different place. We've talked about this, and you've read about this with your Taylor readings. You had different nationalities living with each other in close proximity. The attractiveness of the 13 colonies resulted in huge population growth. In the 80 years between 1690 and 1770, the population grew from more or less 200,000 people to over 2 million people. This dramatic increase in a short period of time had an enormous effect on all aspects of colonial life. It affected the politics because you had non-British citizens being governed by British government officials, British government structures, which were foreign. It affected the economics of colonial life because there were more people. That meant there was more production of stuff and more consumption of stuff. There were religious effects because you had different religious groups living in close proximity to one another, and that resulted in interaction between different religious groups. The social structures were affected among colonists from different nationalities, among colonists with slaves, and between Native Americans and all of the people who are arriving in North America. And the other major area of effect is geography. The impact that this tremendous increase of just human beings in one place, to put it simply, it has negative effects on the geography or on the land and on the environment. This quotation from a British official in the colonies is an excellent example of the relationship between geography and humans. Please pause the video and take a moment to read and consider it. When you're done, when you feel like you have a good sense of what is being said here, please push play again. So when you look at this, please remember that Europeans have lived in a finite space for a long period of time. In the New World, though, there appears to be enough land for just about everybody. What this official observes is that because the colonists believe there is more land available, they are by nature disconnected from the land because colonists will up and move at a moment's notice, usually when things aren't going well. I'd like you just to take another moment to think about why this official thinks the disconnectedness is a weakness for colonists. When you're ready, you can start this movie up again. One of the largest sources of new immigrants in the 1700s was England. And there was a trend in England that led to this migration, this mass migration from the United Kingdom to the New World. And the trend was that rural peasants looking for jobs or looking to improve their lot in life moved to the urban centers of England. That caused these urban centers to grow very rapidly, but there wasn't enough work, there wasn't enough space for all of these new people. So those who started out as the rural poor just became the urban poor. What the urban poor do is they look for another place to go. So they head to the 13 colonies. The urban poor hope that they can secure some of the vast land that is available there. People from all socioeconomic classes of England migrate during the 18th century. The urban poor come seeking land with the hope that land ownership will improve their socioeconomic status. The middle class come looking for new products and new markets, and the upper class definitely comes across looking to increase their already large financial holdings. Just think about this for a moment. A somewhat wealthy person living in Britain would be, by comparison, a very wealthy person if he or she lived in one of the colonies, because their wealth would be proportionately greater in the New World than in the Old. Once these people arrive in the colonies, another pattern emerges. Migrants arrive in the colonies' port towns and cities, so they arrive in these areas, which are the most urbanized areas in the colonies. Those seeking land don't want to stick around in these cities, they want to go out and find the land. So the new settlers start to move west to the frontier. In their search for unused land, these colonists come into contact, and it's usually violent contact, with Native Americans who are trying to protect their own land. More often than not, the Native Americans are pushed off their land by the large numbers of Europeans. This red line that you see is the Proclamation Line of 1763, and it established the limit of the 13 colonies, the British government said that the British colonists could not expand westward or travel westward beyond this boundary, and that all land west of this boundary was being set aside for the First Nations people, which was the British government's way of protecting the fur trade. So what we have in this area right here, where all these colonists have come, is the periphery of the colonies. And we've talked about the relationship between the core and the periphery. So in your minds, you're saying, oh, right, the periphery is very difficult to govern. It's so far away from the core that colonists are basically taking care of themselves. And with each generation that they take care of themselves, they feel themselves to be more and more independent. Politically speaking, the population on the periphery is either underrepresented or not represented at all in the colonial legislature. So the authorities' legitimacy is generally mistrusted on the frontier. And once you have distrust of authority on one periphery, it pretty much spreads to all of them. And if we can think even bigger picture here, all of these 13 colonies are on the periphery of the British Empire. So this statistic is meant to be an example of this relationship between core and periphery. Again, pause the video, have a look at it, and when you're ready to go, press play again and we'll talk some more. Welcome back. We've seen before that religion is a unifying force in society. The Church of England was the dominant church in England. We know that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, as were other colonies, as places for people who did not agree with that church specifically. In Virginia, which was a predominantly Church of England colony, between 1769 and 1774, there is this exodus from the Church of England to the Baptist Church. What is important to our purposes today is not what the Baptist Church is, but what it is not. It is not the Church of England, and so it appeals to the colonists. The hold of the Church of England isn't as strong on the periphery as it is on the core, so you have colonists leaving the Church of England and moving to another church. So in conclusion, one of the long-term causes of the American Revolution is population growth and movement. The population in the British colonies was both A, increasingly diverse, and by that I mean not British, and B, moving away from the more strictly controlled centers of authority, whether it be the United Kingdom or the urban centers in the colonies, and they're moving to the fringes where there is more independence. The second long-term cause of the American Revolution was economic expansion within the 13 colonies. And here you have a very nice schematic that shows how the increase in population, which we just discussed, has an effect on the economics of the 13 colonies. So as population increases, the amount of consumption also increases. And that means that food and other materials get used up by more people. If we concentrate on food supplies and the amount of consumption increases, the amount of food that is available for all people decreases. This decrease in the supply results in an increase in the price because there are fewer goods, people are willing to pay more for them, and certainly vendors are willing to charge more for them. This increase in prices results in an increase in wealth for merchants. And people see these merchants making more money and they think to themselves, wow, I gotta get into that game. So we end up getting more merchants involved in the sale of whatever item or materials we're talking about. As more people arrive, then we need greater infrastructure. We need buildings, we need some sort of roads, thoroughfares, not paved, but thoroughfares to travel between urban centers. And this infrastructure gets centered in cities. So these are dedicated places for lots of people to live so that they can consume goods. Once you start building the cities, then the number of people starts increasing again because people are migrating to these cities for jobs and for food and materials. That's a very quick walkthrough of this cycle. But hopefully that makes sense. Please feel free to pause or rewind to review that. The 13 colonies have become an integral part of the British Empire's economy. They are an enormous consumer market, but they are also a tremendous source of natural resources and some manufactured goods, but very few. This map represents what is called the Triangle of Trade, which is an expression invented by economists and historians to describe the trade relationship between three different points. So natural resources are traveling from the colonies to the mother country. The mother country is producing manufactured goods and sending them back to its colonies for money, and then Africa is being used as a natural resource for gold, ivory, spices, and some wood, but it's also the resource is human beings. The slave economy drives the production of natural resources here in the colonies, which then get shipped back to England, which manufactures goods based on those natural resources, and the cycle continues round and round and round. As the population grows in the 13 colonies, they begin to consume more goods, more luxury items, and unfortunately, more slaves. And this increases the volume of traffic across the Atlantic Ocean. And just as proof, I want to show you this map that I found. It was created based on the historical records of where British ships traveled between 1750 and 1800. So you can see that this area was a dominant area for trade. We also have a lot of shipping going around to India and to Southeast Asia. This triangle is quite clear in this map. So the economy of the 13 colonies is growing and growing quickly. In 1745, about 50% of all British shipping is engaged in commerce or trade with the colonies. And British North America is taking in or absorbing about 25% of English exports, which is huge. By 1765, the colonies are importing 1.9 million pounds worth of goods, and they are exporting 1.15 million pounds worth of goods, so that we're looking at approximately here. The difference between 1.9 and 1.15 is, it sounds big, but it's actually pretty small. And if it were up to the British government, what they'd prefer is to have a much greater profit margin from its colonies. They would prefer something like this. This is a huge difference that swings in the favor of the British government and of citizens living in England. The fact that the 13 colonies is becoming so economically powerful and that Britain is becoming a little bit financially dependent on the 13 colonies is dangerous. So to sum this up, the traditional economic relationship between a mother country and a colony is that the colony is to be financially dependent on the mother country. And that's certainly what we have seen when you studied New France and when you looked at the early days of Canada in the Grade 8 history course. The natural resources and agricultural output in the 13 colonies has created a financial situation where the economic success of the mother country is starting to become dependent on the colony. And that's a dangerous role reversal, especially for England. If the colonies perceive that they have some more economic power, then the authority that the British government has will be undermined. And so this is the end of my second argument. At the end of the first argument, I said because of the relationship between core and periphery and how authority works at those different levels, people in the colonies are starting to see themselves as politically, if not socially, independent. And now, with this economic expansion, it's possible that individuals are starting to see themselves, or colonies are starting to see themselves as potentially economically independent. The third long-term cause of the American Revolution was the imperial reform that the British Parliament and Crown under King George III attempted in the middle of the 18th century, and here's my attempt to show that visually. The British Empire's resources were being drained, and the King and Parliament wanted to stop the financial bleeding. The 7 Years' War, or what in the United States is called the French and Indian War, was a huge financial drain on the British government. They had to send material, they had to send troops, they had to quarter the troops, they had to make sure there was ammunition for the troops. It was enormous. The national debt for the British government in 1756 was 75 million pounds. By the end of the war, just 7 years later, that debt had ballooned to $132 million, which is almost double. Some mathematicians and historians got together and they determined that the interest on the 1763 debt was equal to 60% of the government's budget for the next year. 60% of their budget just went to paying the interest on loans. So the British government is strapped for cash. And so they need to figure out ways to get some money back. And one of the ways that governments do that is by increasing taxes. Here is a partial list of taxes and laws that British government passed in the 1760s and 1770s in an attempt to shore up its financial situation. A number of these are outright taxes, which are meant to generate revenue for the government. The Quartering Act was a cost-saving measure. Instead of having to put its own soldiers up in barracks and to feed them in mess halls and things. The British government said that soldiers basically could just move into colonists' houses, and the colonists had a duty to feed and board these British soldiers. Which you can just imagine a British soldier shows up at your door one day and says, I'm going to be staying here for the next 3 months. It's a great invasion of privacy. But the most upsetting of these acts was the 1765 Stamp Act. And what made it so upsetting for the colonists was that it was a direct tax on the people. Up until 1764 and up until the moment before the Stamp Act is passed, any taxes that the colonists have paid have been created or legislated by the colonial governments. In 1765, though, the British government circumvents those colonial governments and taxes the people directly. And this is a huge, huge problem for colonists, and rightly so, because the colonists have no representation in the Parliament buildings in London. They only have representation in their colonial legislatures. So very quickly, a very famous expression is born, which is no taxation without representation. How can you tax us when we don't even have a representative in Parliament to argue against it or in support of it and to represent our views on this issue? So that's really a big one. That really gets the colonists' goat. It really fires them up. So here's the situation we're left with in the 13 colonies. The British government is basically trying to plug holes in its financial bucket. Its bucket is emptying. So they come up with the Stamp Act, they come up with the Sugar Act, they try to, instead of building barracks for a standing army, they say that they can be, housed by British citizens. They try to create a border that colonists won't go past so that they don't send more soldiers into the West and figure out how they're going to house them, how they're going to feed them, and how they're going to keep them well supplied with uniforms and blankets and ammunition and all that business. Attempts to tax the colonists, as we saw with the Stamp Act, are met with great resistance. So the government actually decides that what they have to do to enforce these laws is send more soldiers over, which just increases the cost further. So in the end, these attempts at imperial reform, or these acts of Parliament, when added to a growing sense of colonial independence, that is economic, political, and religious, and when you add that to a large population that is increasingly distrusting of central authority, to me, there's no other option except the American Revolution. And for any Star Wars fans or science fiction fans, there's an alternate version of history for you. I hope this video was helpful, and if you have any questions, by all means, please email me or let's talk about it in class. Thank you.